Alright lads, today we're going to be taking a look at the new South African vehicles added to the British line in the recent XY update. Due to this video looking at a lot of individuals, we will not be able to go into such details found in my regular reviews, but I still hope to give you a detailed and thorough analysis of each vehicle. Starting with the lower tiers, and we have these two strange looking little wheeled vehicles. First up is the SARC Mk.2, armed with a 2-pounder gun. Despite the funny looking appearance, its performance of this tank is rather good. It is highly mobile and accelerates quickly. Its power to weight ratio of 17 horsepower per tonne being incredibly good for a battle rating 2.7 vehicle. The gun is basically lifted straight off the Matilda 2 tank, giving you a highly mobile vehicle with a quick firing, hard hitting, short stabilised gun. This is of course a quick firing 40mm cannon. Being a low caliber gun, the tank has a pretty good reload time of 2.8 seconds with an ace crew, allowing you to pump a lot of lead down range. The ammunition is also taken straight from the Matilda, mainly using the solid shot ammunition, but you do get a rather underwhelming APHE round with 20 grams of TNT filler. As well as the main gun, you have two 30 caliber machine guns mounted on the roof of the vehicle, which will allow you to annoy any open top tank. Armour wise, the thickest part of this tank is 20mm thick, and the turret front is only 14.5mm thick, leaving you vulnerable to all guns in the game larger than a 50 cal. This vehicle is basically a Matilda 2 on wheels. It trades the mobility for arguably the Matilda's strongest asset, its armour. But I think the high speed does make this tank a dark horse on the battlefield. No one expects you to be this fast. In terms of whether you have to grind this vehicle, well you kind of have to, as all of the other South African vehicles lead on from this line. Our next tank is the SARC Mk.2 6-pounder. This is basically a copy of the previous tank, except the turret has been slightly enlarged to house a 57mm 6-pounder gun, the same gun as found on the Crusader tank. This naturally gives the tank better firepower, with your top round being able to penetrate 122mm of armour, but as the calibre is slightly larger, the rate of fire is lower, with your reload speed dropping down to 4 seconds with an ace crew, which to be honest still isn't terrible. This increase in firepower sees the tank's battle rating increase from 2.7 to 3.3. The reason for me to point this out is because pretty much everything else about the vehicle stays the same. The armour is practically identical, apart from the turret front thickness doubling, from 14mm to 30mm, but this is largely meaningless. The mobility is also identical, as a 6-pounder variant retains a 17 horsepower per tonne power to weight ratio. The increased battle rating does allow it to be brought along several powerful British vehicles, including the premium Cromwell RP3, Cromwell 5 and the Churchill 1. Like the 2-pounder variant, grinding this tank is mandatory, but it is well worth the small grind in my opinion, as it gives the British a highly mobile little light tank with a gun capable of low penning even the monster Soviet heavies found at battle rating 4.3. For our next vehicle, we are slightly jumping the gun a little bit. We'll talk about the Ratel 90 in the next segment. For now, the Eland 90 is basically a clone of the French AML 90. This is a 4-wheeled little scout car, armed with a low pressure 90mm cannon, hence the name. This vehicle is a battle rating 7.0 and fits very nicely into the British Centurion 7.3 lineup, where if you've been watching my streams, we've been having a lot of fun zipping around in it. And you really are zipping around, as the vehicle has a power to weight ratio of 15 horsepower per tonne. Which is good, but not amazing. But remember, it's a wheeled vehicle, so it has a top speed of 90km/h in a straight line. True, you can only really achieve this speed on solid paved maps, but it's still faster than most opponents on all terrain. Going on to the survivability, and the thickest part of the armour of this vehicle is 12mm thick. So yeah, going over a bump too fast it will destroy this tank. And you actually can destroy the wheels of this tank by crashing into objects too fast. The tank also only has a crew of 3 men, and as you can imagine, they are packed in there pretty tightly, so you're basically dead in a single hit, no matter where you get hit, so don't play overly aggressively. We now come on to the gun, and this is the 90mm GT2 cannon. Its main ammunition is a heat-fast round travelling at 750m per second, very low compared to the Centurion Mark III's 1400m per second Sable round. This makes aiming and leading at long range a little bit tricky, but you can use your great mobility to close the distance before engaging. The round itself is pretty powerful, being able to penetrate 320mm of armour. It's basically a clone of the heat-fast round found on the American M46 Tiger and other early Cold War main battle tanks. As I mentioned earlier, the tank is pretty cramped inside, only allowing you to carry 29 rounds of ammunition, as well as giving you a pretty long reload for a light tank. With an ace crew, your top fire rate is 6.7 seconds. To be perfectly honest with you lads, the Eland 90 is quickly becoming one of my favourite vehicles in game. It's fast, powerful, and more importantly, backed up by some of the most powerful rank 4 and 5 tanks in the game. Moving on to the next vehicle, and the Ratel 90 is actually located before the Eland in the tech tree, but the next 3 vehicles all share a similar chassis, so it makes sense to cover them all in one segment, rather than wasting time jumping back and forth. Unlike the Eland 90 which uses a 4-wheeled chassis, the Ratel uses a 6-wheel chassis. This makes them much larger and gives them slightly worse handling characteristics. There are 6 points of contact with the ground compared to the Eland's 4. This means that the turning circle is larger, which when combined with the larger size of the hull, makes the tank feel incredibly sloppy in urban environments, as you often have to Austin power the tank around tight corners. The chassis itself has a power to weight ratio of 14 horsepower per tonne and has a maximum top speed of 105 km/h. This speed and power isn't too bad, but as I said, the larger hull just makes the tank feel sloppy, and in a way, inefficient. The performance is just too little for a hull so big. We then come on to the survivability, and the thickest part of the armour is only 20mm thick. This is the upper frontal plate, and the rest of the tank is mainly sheet metal at only 10 to 8mm thick. Like the Eland, the Ratel has a crew of 3 men, and all 3 are located at the very front of the vehicle. Taking ground at the front of this tank will pretty much instantly kill the vehicle. Alternatively, if you get shot in the rear of the tank, it shouldn't kill any crew members. Moving on to the weapons, and it's basically the exact same turret as found on the Eland 90, that being the GT2 90mm cannon, with the exact same ammunition. I mentioned earlier that this tank just feels inefficient. It's a lot larger, slower, and more importantly far less sneaky than the Eland 90, all whilst doing nothing really better than it. Apart from being battle rating 6.7, compared to the Eland 90's battle rating 7.0, there is no real reason to use this tank after unlocking the Eland. After the Ratel 90, we have the Ratel 20. As you might be able to guess due to the suffix of this name, this Ratel is armed with a 20mm autocannon, rather than a large caliber main gun found on the previous 2 vehicles. Due to using the Ratel chassis, it has the same power to weight ratio of 14 horsepower per tonne, and the top speed of 105 km/h, as well as retaining the feeling of sluggishness, and the armour is also just as bad. Where this vehicle differs is its weaponry, and to be honest, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The main weapon has gone from a heater-fast firing 90mm cannon to a rapid firing 20mm autocannon, the same gun as found on the R3T20, all whilst moving up in battle rating to 7.3. The 20mm cannon has decent levels of elevation, allowing it to be used as a makeshift anti-aircraft vehicle. However, the turret rotation speed is rather poor, making it hard to track even slow-moving vehicles. The ammunition is also pretty weak, at least against ground targets, with the best belts only being able to penetrate around 60mm of armour. This penetration is very lackluster, and is made worse by the fact you do not have a stabiliser, making the gun incredibly weak at battle rating 7.3, as you can't penetrate or effectively aim at most enemies unless stationary. As well as your 20mm cannon, you also have a Eland missile launcher, the same ATGM as found on the battle rating 8.0 Warrior. This missile can penetrate 530mm of armour and travels at 200m per second, giving it similar flight characteristics to the missiles found on the BMP-2. This is quite a mismatch of weapons. Your missiles are superb, but your cannon is very weak, and is only really useful against air targets. This leaves you without much of a purpose. While in real life it was obviously a patrol and support vehicle, War Thunder has no real need for a vehicle like this. It's far too large and obnoxious to fulfill the role that the BMP-2 would do, and it isn't well suited for air defence. To be honest, the only real thing good about this is memeing. Killing somebody in this tank just makes you feel good. It's almost insulting to the enemy that died to you. I genuinely have had some fun in this tank, but I think the Eland 90 beats it in terms of practicability. Finally, for the Ratel family, we come on to the ZT3A2 variant. Again, it uses the same hull as the other Ratels, so basically no armour and very mediocre performance. Where this tank differs is the turret. Instead of having a cannon, it uses a triple-barreled missile launcher. This has pros and cons. The fact that you have 3 missiles which can be ripple fired is very powerful, as you can essentially spam missiles at enemies. However, these missiles are fairly slow compared to most modern APF-SDS rounds being fired at battle rating 8.7. This basically stops you from trading really. If you and an enemy fire at the same time, the enemy's round will impact and kill you first. This can lead to some frustrating gameplay on wide open maps. Due to your missiles being slow, you will have to expose yourself for a long amount of time in order to guide the missile onto a target, whereas a conventional cannon-armed tank can pop out, fire, and get back into cover in a matter of seconds. Another issue is close quarters combat. Not only is the Ratel hull very tall, making it unsubtle, the depression of the missile launcher is very low, at only 5 degrees of gun depression. This means at very close range you cannot depress the launcher to hit small vehicles. It also limits the tank's usefulness on ridgelines, a tactic which would well suit a vulnerable support vehicle. There are good positives though. For a battle rating 8.7 vehicle, you have amazing thermal imaging quality. Your thermals are 2nd gen, whereas most other rank 6 tanks, such as the Leopard L44, are still using 1st gen thermals. This gives you a big advantage on more rural open maps. The missiles themselves are very powerful, despite being rather slow. Your stock missile is the ZT3A2, which can penetrate 650mm of armour, and your upgraded missile is an evolution of the ZT3, designated as the ZT3A2. It can penetrate 800mm of armour and features a tandem charge warhead, essentially allowing it to ignore ERA blocks commonly found on the Soviet vehicles. Apart from the missiles, the vehicle is only armed with a single rifle caliber machine gun mounted in the turret, which needless to say is rather ineffective against Leos and T-72s, so don't miss with your missiles. Overall, the ZT3A2 is a decent addition. It's powerful on open maps, especially in sim games, but it's mounted on a hull that, as I've said multiple times now, is rather inefficient. Other nations have missile carriers that are smaller, faster and equally as powerful, allowing these tanks, such as the M3A3 Bradley and the Beg-like Panzer, to fulfill the same battlefield role, all whilst coming in a smaller, more sneaky package. We now move on to another wheelie boy, and this vehicle is by no means new. It's been in the game for over a year now, and this is of course the Rooikat Mk.1. I have a completely separate review of this tank if you'd like a more in-depth look, but the reason to cover this tank is the fact that it has been moved into the South African line, and is used as the basis for several other vehicles which we'll cover shortly. The Rooikat uses a chassis system with 8 wheels, giving it a good top speed of 121 km per hour. Of course this is just theoretical, and you will never achieve this speed in an actual game. The hull itself has an engine producing 567 horsepower and a weight of 26.5 tons, giving it a power to weight ratio of 21.4 horsepower per ton. This is pretty good, especially for a battle rating 8.3 vehicle. Something else about the Rooikat's hull is its lack of armour. Being designed mainly for mobility, the armour and survivability paid a price, with the thickest part of the armour being just 30mm thick. It certainly will not be shrugging off incoming rounds. The gun of the Rooikat is relatively good, despite being a low caliber cannon. At only 76mm in diameter, the APF SDS round can still penetrate a fairly impressive 311mm of penetration. This gives it better performance than the Orbal HVG's 60mm cannon. The gun is also fully stabilised and has a laser rangefinder, but lacks thermal imaging, something which hurts a lot in an up tier. Overall, the Rooikat is Britain's first taste of a top tier wheelie boy, and at battle rating 8.3 it's quite a good one. Although the Rooikat isn't new, it still remains a staple of the British 8.3 lineup. While its gun has been overshadowed by the larger 105mm guns found on the successive Rooikat hulls, it is still more than capable of dealing with all battle rating 9.3 vehicles. The ZA35 is the newest spag available in the British tech tree. It uses the same hull as the Rooikat Mk.1, and therefore has the same mobility and armour characteristics. It has the same power to weight ratio of 21.4 horsepower per ton, as well as a very bad maximum of 30mm of armour. I actually cannot figure out the differences between the ZA35 and the Mk.1. They look pretty similar from the outside. Oh wait, that's right, it's the massive radar sticking out the back of the bloody thing. The ZA35 is armed with two 35mm cannons, and like the earlier Rooikat, it does not have thermal imaging. But due to its role as a spag, it isn't too hindered by its absence. The ammunition of this vehicle is pretty decent, but it lacks an APDS belt, but the regular armour piercing rounds are still good enough to troll enemy light tanks. Overall, the ZA35 has been one of the biggest additions to the British tech tree, both in terms of physical size and impact. It uses the same great chassis as the Mk.1, giving it insane levels of mobility for a spag, and due to its designation, it's also very cheap to spawn, and as you've probably seen in the background footage, it is by no means weak against ground targets. While it does lack thermals, due to its battlefield role it doesn't really need them, and due to its battle rating of 8.3, it fits incredibly well into the main British lineup of rank 6, that being the battle rating 8.3 Chieftains. This vehicle is great, and addresses the series of weaknesses in the British lineups, that being both a lack of speed and effective AA vehicles. We then come on to the premium Rooikat 105. Again, this isn't a new vehicle, but it is of South African origin, and may as well be covered again. This vehicle uses the same chassis as the other variants, except the weight of the vehicle is higher, giving the next set of Rooikats slightly worse manoeuvrability than the previous models. The Rooikat 105 weighs 28.5 tonnes, 2 tonnes heavier than the Mk.1D. This gives the 105 a power to weight ratio of 19.9 horsepower per tonne, compared to the Mk.1D's 21.4 horsepower per tonne. In the grand scheme of things, this slight drop in performance isn't really felt. You can't really tell the difference between the two types of Rooikat. Where these tanks do differ is the firepower. Whereas the Mk.1D uses the 76mm cannon, the 105 uses the GT7 105mm gun. Like the other Rooikats, it is fully stabilised and gets a slightly better ammunition than the previous model. Your best ammunition is the DM23 round, which is fine for its battle rating at 8.7. Unlike the other Rooikats, this tank does get thermal imaging. However, it is very low resolution. Overall, the Rooikat uses the same chassis, but has a heavier turret than the previous two vehicles, negatively affecting mobility. This weight increase wasn't wasted though. The thermal imaging and increased gun caliber do make you a more lethal vehicle, although I would say you are let down a little bit by the average ammunition. For example, the Class 3P uses the M33 at the same battle rating, giving it 70mm more penetration. While like the Mk.1D, this vehicle isn't new, it still constitutes the main premium for the British tech tree. While the vehicle is fairly mobile and powerful, I feel like this tank is not equal to some of the newer premiums. The T72 AV basically negates all of the older premiums, at least when it comes to bang for your $60. What happens if you take a Rooikat 105 and install an autoloader? Well, you get the MTTD. There isn't too much to say about this vehicle. It has the exact same characteristics as the Rooikat 105 in pretty much every way. Same mobility, armour and firepower, same thermals, same ammunition. The only difference is the presence of a 6.7 second autoloader. While this is good for poorly trained crews, the reload speed of 6.7 seconds is pretty much the average for all rank 6 vehicles, so it doesn't really give you too much of an advantage, at least compared to NATO vehicles. As I said, it uses the same hull, so it also has the same power to weight ratio of 19.9 horsepower per tonne, giving it acceptable levels of mobility, but nothing exceptional. The armour, just like all the other variants, is also very lacking. Overall, the MTTD is arguably a better Rooikat 105. It has the same gun, ammunition and thermal imaging, but with a better reload. While it has the same average mobility as the premium, it is still good enough for battle rating 8.7, but it is still vastly outmatched in an up tier. Vehicles like the Rooikat 90 just completely outclass it in all aspects other than thermal imaging. While the MTTD is a nice addition to the British tech tree, it isn't really a standout star of this update. The real cock and ball torture starts now, boys. Do you want another battle rating 8.3 British tank that's dead on arrival? Well, here you go. The Olifant Mk.1 is basically just a Centurion that has been upgraded beyond its capabilities. It has very poor armour and even worse mobility. It has a power to weight ratio of 13.9 horsepower per tonne, which when compared to the Rooikat Mk.1D's 21 horsepower per tonne, it is incredibly poor. So with this poor mobility, surely there is something to compensate for it. Well, no. Again, the Rooikat Mk.1D at 8.3 gets a gun capable of penetrating 311mm of armour, and the Olifant gets a DM23 clone capable of penetrating 337mm of armour. This isn't too bad by itself, but combined with the poor mobility, it just leaves the tank feeling sluggish and mediocre. The best way to describe this vehicle is basically an even worse version of the Shot Cabriolet, which truly just shows you how evil Gaijin are. Forcing me to review this tank brought back PTSD from the Shot Cabriolet video. This tank is obviously outclassed by vehicles such as the T55AM and pretty much everything at battle rating 8.7 upwards. It's basically just a free Shot Cabriolet and is somewhat usable back up in the British 8.3 lineup, but certainly not a vehicle that I enjoyed playing. Next up we have another Centurion variant. How fun! This is the Olifant Mk.2, and straight away we have a vast improvement to the engine of this tank, bumping the power to weight ratio up to 17.4 horsepower per tonne. While this is better than the Olifant Mk.1, the Mk.2 has also had its battle rating pumped up to 9.3, and at this battle rating, that level of mobility is awful, especially seeing as the XM1 Premium has a power to weight ratio of 28.9 horsepower per tonne. So again, cock and ball torture levels of mobility. The armour is also pretty poor. Against its own gun, the turret can only provide 350mm of armour protection. While this isn't too bad, you should really be using your mobility as your armour at this battle rating. faster, more mobile tanks can literally just outflank you and put shots into your weaker side. Moving on to the gun, and this is where your tank does start to shine. The Olifant Mk.2 uses a 105mm gun. Like the other Centurions, it is fully stabilised and does receive very high resolution thermal imaging. You also get the DM63 round. This can penetrate 436mm of armour, which for a battle rating 9.3 vehicle is incredibly good. While the gun performance is exceptional, the lack of armour and mobility kind of forces you into a static camping playstyle, which as you'd imagine, rather limits your usefulness on most maps. Overall, the Olifant Mk.2 is basically just an over-upgraded Centurion. While the Centurion does well at 7.3, it's painful at 8.3, and damn right suffers at 9.3. The slow speed and poor protection makes you a rolling XP boost for the first time that sees you on an urban map. But on rural, more long-range maps, you can put that great APF SDS round and high-resolution thermal to work. In many ways, the Olifant Mk.2 is the British equivalent of the T-72AV terms. It uses an outdated hull, modified with new ammunition and thermals. Our final vehicle is the TTD, or the knockoff Leopard 2A4, and it kind of fixes the worst parts of the Olifant Mk.2. It weighs 60.5 tonnes and has an engine producing 1250 horsepower, which gives the tank a power to weight ratio of 20.7 horsepower per tonne. While this does give the tank better mobility than the previous vehicle, it is still a little lacklustre, especially for a battle rating 9.7 vehicle. The tank also uses the same 105mm gun as found on the Mk.2, and like the Olifant's gun, it is fully stabilised, but it reverts back to the old first generation thermal optics. You do still retain the DM63 round, giving it very good firepower, despite the battle rating increase to 9.7. The armour of the tank is also quite good. Its turret provides around 380mm of protection against the DM63 round, which is good enough to bounce some of the early APF SDS rounds, but when fully up-tiered, it will be essentially just dead weight. Overall, the TTD is a good addition to the already powerful 9.7 British lineup, but it has the exact same playstyle as the good old Challenger Mk.2 and Mk.3, long-range sniping. The mobility is a little bit better, but a long way off the Vickers Mk.7. The ammunition and the gun are good, but the first generation thermals makes the tank feel like a step backwards from the Olifant Mk.2. They practically have the same armour, mobility and firepower, except at least with the Olifant Mk.2 you can put those great thermals to work. The TTD is a decent backup, but I doubt it will ever constitute the first spawn vehicle of a 9.7 British lineup. To conclude, the South African tech tree adds a heavy scout element to the British tech tree. All of the vehicles are mainly lightly armoured, fast, and with high power weaponry. You shouldn't really be thinking of these tanks as first spawns, or staples of a lineup, rather as second or third spawns, mainly when you need a cheap vehicle towards the end of a game. Most of these tanks, like the Ratel 20, are highly specialised, and lack the all-round capabilities of something like the Centurion Mk.3, a vehicle with the same battle rating as the Ratel. And it's pretty much the same case with all of the other South African vehicles. While the TTD and Olifant Mk.2 can be played as first spawns, the already present Challenger Mk.2 and 3, as well as the Vickers Mk.7 are arguably more effective main battle tanks. If I had to choose my favourite vehicles from the South African line, it would probably be the Eland 90. It's a great backup for the Centurion lineup, as well as the ZT3A2, as it gives the British a highly mobile spag with great anti-air and anti-light vehicle capabilities. While the South African tanks do in my opinion really flush out the British tech tree, I'd still recommend grinding the domestically built British tanks first, as without them, you are essentially roleplaying as the Italian tech tree. Small, fast and annoying, but lacking any real power. Alright lads, thank you very much for watching this video. What do you guys think about this vehicle? If you have any questions or suggestions to improve the channel, then please feel free to leave a comment below. I now have community memberships enabled for the channel. If you'd like access to behind the scenes footage, as well as access to content a few hours early, then please do consider becoming a member. I'd also like to mention that I now have a Twitch account, where I stream pretty frequently, so if you'd like to follow me there, my Twitch handle is SAKO Sniper, the same as this YouTube channel. But if you do enjoy these sorts of reviews, then please do consider leaving a like and subscribing. But more importantly lads, I hope you have a great day, and thank you very much for watching.